Hello and welcome back. This is the week 11 lecture. So I'm sorry to be posting this pretty late in the week. If you guys got my message in Canvas, I have been sick, slowly getting better, but it's been this sort of long battle with, I think it's bronchitis or maybe it was the flu. I don't know, but it sidelined me for about a week. So I'm slowly getting back up to speed, not quite at 100%, but I figured I would go ahead and do this lecture because I really want to wrap up our critical approaches. So that was the goal for this week. I wanted to talk about cultural studies in chapter 9 because this really is our final critical approach that we are going to be reading about in the book. So I wanted to add a little bit to what we see in chapter 9. And after this week, we will really have all of the knowledge of these different critical approaches, these different styles of literary criticism, and we can now use these on our final assignment. So I just wanted to give us kind of the full complement of options. So by this point, we have covered formalism. We have done structuralism along with post structuralism. We've also talked about feminism and gender studies. And now today we're going to wrap up with cultural studies and new historicism. So, new historicism will kind of be a link back to the beginning of the semester when we talked about some of those traditional approaches to literature, the sort of pre academic or pre critical approaches, stuff that's existed for a long time, like biographical approaches, philosophical approaches, and we also talked about the historical approach and how that's always been a popular way to study literature. It's always been a common lens that we can use to really view and analyze literature. So I sort of gave you guys a hint weeks ago that we would come back to the historical approach because unlike a lot of those other traditional approaches that we've kind of moved away from, we still like the historical approach. And it kind of made a comeback in the late 20th century. We'll talk a little bit more about that today. So it will be another option for you guys as you get ready for your second critical response essay. That's going to be due next week. And then, of course, after that's done, we turn our attention to the final paper. And that's really what we spend the final few weeks of the semester doing. But let's start with chapter 9 and cultural studies. I think you guys might enjoy cultural studies, at least certain aspects of it, particularly the pop culture analysis. This is increasingly popular today, and what you'll see is we can use this approach really for a wide variety of different kinds of texts, not just traditional categories of literature. But let's start with just what cultural studies is. This is a very broad term, as they point out in chapter 9, and it is a notoriously difficult term to define. So, in the book, they say that you should really think of cultural studies as more of a set of practices, tendencies, issues, and questions, rather than a really unified critical approach. It sort of developed in the 1960s. It borrows elements from a lot of pre existing critical approaches, some of which we've already talked about, like post-structuralism. It borrows some from postmodernism. We're going to talk about that movement a little bit today. It also borrows some concepts from feminism and gender studies. It also borrows from anthropology and sociology, other academic disciplines. So it comes from a lot of different places. And one thing that they really emphasize in the book is that modern cultural studies is always very interested in power and how art, artistic production, literature, other forms of art can either reinforce existing power structures, they might sort of be pushing back against dominant power structures, they might be reflecting the power, they might be resisting the power, but there's always a lot to say about power and who has it, who doesn't have it, and what's going on with it. So that's a big part of cultural studies, at least for a lot of critics who use this particular approach. And there's this idea that power is largely made possible through discourse. So this is an important word for us this week. So I want to make sure you guys know sort of what they mean when they talk about discourse or multiple discourses in the book. So a discourse is just like an accepted way of thinking, an accepted way of writing or speaking. So we can often think of discourses as just being like narratives or ways of thinking, talking, and writing that are dominant in a particular culture or in a particular society. So at any given moment, we have a lot of major important discourses that are going on. Okay. We are going to be aware of some of them. We might be less aware of others, but they're sort of floating around. Sometimes they're things that we read, right? They are written discourses. Other times they might be stories that we tell. They might be more oral in nature, or they might just sort of break down along certain like social standards or, certain, dominant ways of doing things at any particular time. So we can think of works of literature as participating or even helping to develop certain discourses. Not all discourses have to be literature, but literature will participate in the production of these dominant ways of thinking, writing, and talking. So for a lot of cultural studies critics, they're interested in how discourses get wielded by the people in power because they would often argue that a lot of the ways that power gets formed or exercised is through discourse. And if you do think of these sort of like just like stories, right? Dominant narratives that matter to us. They might be, based on things that are happening right now. They might be based on our history, important values, or, moral beliefs that we have. We do often think of these, whether they're in writing, whether we talk about them, hear them. We do often think of them as narratives, right? We think of them as stories that are important, for whatever reason. They might be real, they might be fictional, but they have importance, in that particular culture or society. So if we think of these as dominant narratives, then we can definitely see how a lot of them will come from literature and a lot of them will be reinforced by literature. Now, literature is just one part of it. There's other factors that go into the creation of discourse, but literature and other forms of art are definitely involved. So that's kind of part of the point that they're making in chapter 9. Power isn't just something that, politicians or, rich people have. It's something that gets disseminated throughout the culture, largely through the stories we tell, the art that we share, and what we might think of as like pop culture and the production of pop culture. So that's all very important for cultural studies. So they talk about, and it's not just discourse, right? But discourse is interacting with actual practices, actual social standards, and things that are really happening. So it's all connected, and that's all fair game for analysis. So in the chapter, they break down four major goals of the cultural studies approach. So let's just run through these quickly. We don't have to spend a whole lot of time on these, but if you're going to use this particular approach, you might want to strive for one or more of these goals. So the first goal, according to the book, is to transcend particular academic categories or disciplines like history or literature. So this is actually pretty interesting, and some students can sort of get into this. It makes the analysis of literature maybe a little bit more accessible. We can move away from just that strict academic sort of definition of whatever it is that we're doing. right? So now, if we're thinking about studying texts, if we're going to use the cultural studies approach, we can think about texts in a more expansive, broad fashion, right? So historically, traditionally, if we're thinking about literary texts, we would be thinking about novels, we would be thinking about poetry, maybe short stories, and plays. Right? So, in other words, we would be thinking about Frankenstein or To His Coy Mistress or the other texts that are often discussed in the book. But with a cultural studies approach, you could really expand the definition of text. And you could look at other types of texts, things that wouldn't necessarily qualify as a novel or a poem, but they're still telling stories. They're still expressing meaning. They're still creating dominant discourses that matter in that particular cultural moment. So in the book, they mention TV shows can be texts, movies can be texts. They're not written, but they're still narratives. I mean, they do have scripts, but we consume them in a more visual way. But you guys have already seen this, we can study or analyze a TV show or a movie in a very similar fashion to what we would do with a work of literature, right? Because a lot of those same narrative elements are going to be present. We're going to have characters. We're going to have a plot. We're going to have a setting. We're going to have themes. We're going to have symbolism, metaphors. A lot of the stuff that functions in literature will also function in a TV show or a movie. It might show up in a different way. It might function differently, but it's a lot of the same material. So we can always look at TV shows, movies, comic books, right? Things that would not have traditionally been considered literature. Now we have more chances to analyze those types of texts, and we can elevate them and say that they might even be equally important to those traditional types of literature. So in the book, they even go further. They say, you could study body piercings, you could study graffiti, right? Stuff that would have been considered very separate from literature a long time ago. Now, they're just other forms of texts. They are other forms of discourses, and they can be studied, analyzed, talked about, just like a poem or a novel. So that can be liberating to some. And again, it's nice to know that you can use some of these tools, some of these methods that we've been practicing with literature, and you can apply them to stuff that might be outside of those traditional categories of literature. It opens up possibilities and it allows you to use your analytical skills on other things, things that you might find more interesting than old novels or old poems, right? So that can be fun for many. So that's the first goal, to kind of move beyond these stuffy, old-fashioned academic categories that say, hey, if it's not literature, don't study it, or at least don't study it in this way. We're opening up new possibilities. So that's goal one. Goal two is to be politically engaged. Now, I think this is up for debate, but in the book, certainly they make the case that a lot of cultural studies critics want to sort of oppose dominant power structures or question the dominant power structures that exist in a particular culture or a particular society. You don't necessarily have to do that, but it is a goal that you can try to achieve. So you might want to champion authors who have been overlooked. Sometimes that might be minority authors, people who have been sort of, minimized, dismissed. We talked about this a little bit a couple of weeks ago with feminism and gender studies, how it's been a big project for a lot of feminist critics to sort of rediscover a lot of important women authors who were publishing and were, successful in previous eras, but maybe they haven't been studied as much. they haven't been analyzed as much. They haven't been considered maybe as important as a lot of male authors. We talked a little bit about that history in the US. So that can definitely be part of a cultural studies approach to try to reclaim authors who maybe did not fit into the mainstream for whatever reason, because of their background, their identity, maybe because of what they wrote about, and we're trying to shine a light on their work. And again, we're sort of moving away from some of these old fashioned ideas about great authors and great books. Like I was saying 2 weeks ago, it is interesting to sort of look at the history, particularly with American literature, U.S. literature, how we determined, who the most important writers were in U.S. literary history. We talked a little bit about that process. It was largely done by a group of white male academics, so they largely chose authors who were kind of like them. So when they were creating that American literary canon, they chose Melville and Whitman and Hawthorne and, Emerson and Thoreau and Poe, all white guys, all great writers who did important work. But there's a lot of other stuff that maybe they missed, maybe they overlooked, they didn't value it as much. And it was a different time. It was 100 years ago. So there were certain prejudices, certain biases that they were working with that we don't necessarily have in the same way today. So again, this can be liberating for some students because we often still get a lot of those great authors and the great books. And if you move into the 20th century, it looks a lot similar, right? You get your Faulkners and your Hemingways, and a lot of these guys are still read and taught and celebrated as the most important authors, at least in our own literary tradition. But for a lot of contemporary students, we might not really connect with those authors very much, right? They're old. Their ideas might seem outdated. Their style will certainly seem outdated oftentimes to a modern reader. So we can expand the canon just meaning sort of that list or that collection of all the best literature. And we can include new stuff that was written by women, written by non-white writers, written by people who were outside of the mainstream, and we can study them just like we studied those old guys. So that's the second goal. The third goal I want to spend a little bit of time on because it's another thing that I do think can be fun and it's very relevant, I think, today. It's getting away from another old fashioned idea, which was the separation between high art and low art. So you guys might have heard some variation of this. Sometimes it's referred to as highbrow versus lowbrow. And we've kind of gotten rid of this distinction increasingly in the modern world. It still exists in some ways, but by moving away from it, again, it's opening up more opportunities. So, what I mean by this, like high art traditionally referred to things like poetry, things like the theater, right? Plays, opera, ballet. That would have all been considered highbrow. That was high art, which, in other words, it was just considered important. It was considered artistically significant, right? The people who created those art forms were looked at as really important artists, and those types of texts were considered worthy of study, and, they were sort of held in high esteem. But there was a distinction between that kind of art and what was often called lowbrow or low art. So, low art at various times would have included things like novels. We wouldn't think of novels that way now, but when novels first came along, at least in the English language tradition, back in the 1700s, novels were considered really inferior to older forms of highbrow art, for example, poetry and the theater. It's kind of funny, but novels were considered like trashy, sort of just like mindless entertainment. We've talked about this a little bit. In fact, a lot of early novelists even sort of pushed back and tried to argue, hey, there's actually some important moral lessons in my novel, so it's okay for your kids to read it. Because there was this idea back then that novels were kind of disreputable. Again, kind of like the way maybe people talk about reality TV today. Like it's entertaining, it's fun, but it doesn't have a lot of intellectual value. It doesn't have a lot of artistic value. So that might strike us as strange because we don't think about novels like that now, right? So that just shows that these definitions change, these categories change over time. So now novels are very respected. Novels are generally considered to be a little bit more highbrow, but it depends on the novel, right? If we're talking about Frankenstein, yeah, that's kind of high art, right? We regard Frankenstein as a very high artistic achievement. It gets taught in high school and college and graduate school. Mary Shelley's a very respected writer. We see the skill that went into the creation of that particular book. But think about other kinds of novels. Think about romance novels, or like spy thrillers, the kind of stuff that you might buy at an airport or in like a grocery store checkout line. Those novels might still be considered a little bit more lowbrow, right? Fun, entertaining. You can read them in a day or two, the stuff that you might take to the beach on vacation. So there's different kinds of novels, but again, we don't even always make much of a distinction between what's highbrow or lowbrow. Nowadays, it's more about just our preferences, what we like, what we enjoy, what kinds of genres we enjoy. If you like romance novels, you read romance novels, and you probably don't spend a lot of time thinking, oh, well, this is a lowbrow novel, and I might want to check out a highbrow novel. We don't care as much, and that's one of the points that they're making in the chapter, is that these distinctions between high and low don't really matter in the way that they used to, maybe 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. They're not as important now, right? We have collapsed a lot of those distinctions. But for some other examples of things that used to be considered lowbrow, think about TV. So when television first became popular and when everybody was able to afford a television by like the 1950s, some of the same arguments were getting made. Like, oh, you don't want to let your kids watch a lot of TV. It's going to rot their brains. It's not intellectually stimulating. It's just mindless entertainment. We heard some of the same things about movies when movies first developed at the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s. So often with new technology or new forms of literature or new texts, new discourses, a lot of times they will get labeled as lowbrow because they're often more accessible to the general public. That's another thing that's kind of important about how this distinction used to work. Highbrow stuff like the opera, poetry, the theater, that stuff was kind of reserved for the highly educated, wealthy classes in earlier times, right? That stuff really was not intended for the general public in the same way. The idea was you had to sort of be refined. You had to be educated to a certain extent to enjoy those things. But stuff like popular novels, TV, movies, and then later comic books, a lot of the stuff that we have on the internet now, all of that's a lot more democratic, just in the classic sense, meaning that it's for everybody, right? And that's often what got it labeled initially as lowbrow. Again, that was true of early novels. Early novels were easier to read than poetry or plays. They were more exciting. They were more geared towards a middle class audience or a working class audience. You didn't have to be a wealthy person who had gone to college necessarily to read a popular novel 100 years ago. You needed to be literate, but by that point, most people were. But a lot of people didn't go to college back then. So maybe you weren't going to go to the opera, but you could pick up a popular novel, a paperback, and read it during your break from work. And that was fine. That was more accessible. But some, critics back then would have said, well, that kind of makes it less artistically valuable. So there was a lot of snobbery built into it, right? There was a lot of sort of class distinction, right? The best art kind of belonged to the wealthy, educated classes. But as our society became more egalitarian, as more people went to college, as more people started to read and experience these different types of literature, again, a lot of these distinctions collapsed, and we would argue that they probably don't mean as much today. And in fact, a lot of artists today, a lot of writers enjoy sort of mixing aspects of high culture and low culture. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. And they talk about this concept of good taste. Again, I don't know how important that is to people really anymore. That used to matter. And again, it was kind of this idea that in order to have good taste, you needed to have been very educated, you needed to have money, you needed to have a lot of leisure time to enjoy all of those highbrow forms of art. But nowadays, a lot of cultural studies critics would point out that that's not really true. And good taste is very subjective, right? And it doesn't exclusively belong to any class or any type of person, right? And what we used to think of as good taste was really just a combination of like certain social, economic, and political factors that kind of favored some people over others. And it wasn't that, the favored people necessarily had better taste. They just had more money, more access, and probably more education. And that's not so much the case anymore. So you can always go back and sort of do some interesting analysis of older texts by using some of our new ideas about how high and low really don't mean as much, and they can often sort of work together, right? Aspects of high culture and aspects of low culture can exist together in the more modern world. So that's the third goal, is to really get rid of that distinction altogether between high and low. And then the fourth is to not only, the fourth goal that they mentioned in the chapter is to not only study the cultural work itself or the text itself, but also the means of production. How did that text get made? So sometimes these can be interesting questions to ask, and it can give, these are questions that you can pursue, and it can give you more to do. It can give you more content to create. So some questions like, who supported the artist? Who published the book? Who distributed the book? Who is buying the book? So you can think more about audience, a little bit like the reader response approach that we mentioned as a sort of reaction to formalism, right? This idea that the readers matter, and maybe we can study the readers just like we study the text itself. All right, so who's reading it? Who is the audience, and what can we learn or say about the audience? But you can also think about, publishing companies. Nowadays, a lot of stuff is online. So who's putting this out? Who is publishing it? Who is distributing it? Who's reading it? So it's not just the text itself, but it's how the text gets made, and it's also how the text is getting consumed, right, by the paying public. So those are just other things that you can look at with the cultural studies approach. All right, so the next thing they cover in the chapter is ethnic studies. So, a little bit like what we were discussing a couple of weeks ago with feminism and gender studies. We're just expanding our categories and looking at a wider group of different literature, different texts produced by different people. Right? So this can make some uncomfortable. Not everybody wants to really think too much about racial or ethnic categories. So you don't have to, but this is just an option. Particularly if you're interested in a certain author or a certain period or a certain text, this is just another lens that you can use to approach that text. So they talk about African American writers, Latino writers, Native American writers, Asian American writers. These are just categories that we can use. And a lot of cultural studies critics would say that traditionally, historically, a lot of these categories have been neglected. A lot of these writers have not received the same amount of attention, the same amount of analysis, the same amount of scholarly attention as, all those classic white authors that we've mentioned. So when they talk about African American writers, I've mentioned a few of these names before. Phyllis Wheatley, Harriet Wilson, some important writers from previous eras, from the 17 and 1800s. More recently, you could look at writers like Toni Morrison, Langston Hughes, Ralph Ellison. They're obviously tackling a lot of thematic material connected to racism, connected to their own experiences as African Americans in the US. So, ideas of like double consciousness, maybe bicultural identities, the importance of certain techniques. Again, this is, not totally unique to African American writers, but there are certain things, certain, thematic materials or certain literary techniques that you can definitely find in the works of a lot of African American writers, like irony, parody, tragedy, bitter comedy. So all of that sort of comes out of certain historical factors, social factors, and that can just be a category that you explore if you're interested. Same thing with Latino or Latina writers. Again, this is a very broad term, right? It encompasses a lot of different writers who might have been previously overlooked. So we can rediscover the foundational role that a lot of Latino writers had in earlier American literature, or we can look at more contemporary writers who might be active right now. So you could go back to the 19th century and a writer like Maria Ruiz de Burton, who was probably the first Latina writer to be published in the US, at least as far as we know. She has an interesting history. She actually was a native, I believe. I want to say she was either from California or she came to California at a young age, but she married an army officer who fought for the Union during the Civil War. So that's why she took on his name. But he died pretty young, and she embarked on her writing career after he passed. So she wrote some important novels in the late 19th century and really kind of blazed the trail for future Latino writers. So you could look at her, you could look at more contemporary writers like Sandra Cisneros, Gloria Anzaldúa, who are, doing stuff in the 20th century about identity, the border, their own specific sort of cultural heritage, stuff having to do with language, identities, political boundaries, shifting space and time, all of that kind of stuff. This idea of crossing over, crossing a border that can be literal and figurative. So those would be some dominant ideas if you wanted to pursue that particular category. You could think about Native American writers who were definitely excluded for a long time from the US literary canon, but now we've gone back and we've discovered some guys that were writing a long time ago. We can even go back to the sort of oral tradition of Native American groups that predate European contact. right? So a lot of Native Americans had their own oral storytelling traditions that still exist. And they really were not written down until much later. But these are old traditions, these are old stories that have circulated for a long time. And now they've been written down and translated, and they can be consumed a lot more easily by readers. But also, you can go back to the 17 and 1800s, and there were Native Americans writing back then. Samson Occam, William Apis, they are two of the earlier Native American authors to write in English. And, I think both of them were pastors, ministers. So they wrote a lot of religious texts, but they also recorded history, sort of cultural commentary of their time. John Roland Ridge is an interesting guy. I read a little bit about him when I was in school. He's the first Native American to publish a novel in U.S. history. So John Roland Ridge was a Cherokee from Georgia, and he went to California at an early age. And in the 1840s, he wrote a novel about a Mexican bandit named Joaquin Murrieta. And that, as far as we know, is the first work of fiction published by a Native American in the U.S. Again, not the first published work of any kind by a Native American. Those earlier guys had written stuff, but John Roland Ridge was a newspaper man and a novelist. So he was the first one to tackle a work of fiction. And it's a really interesting novel. You can still find it. It's still in print. It's kind of very loosely based on a real bandit who was active during the gold rush era in California, like the end of the 1840s, right after the U.S.-Mexico War, which of course drastically changed the geography of the Western U.S. So John Roland Ridge lived in San Francisco, wrote for newspapers, learned that history while he was living out there, and even sort of was experiencing it in real time. And then he wrote that novel. It was pretty popular, and a lot of other stuff got published later about Murrieta, who was a pretty popular sort of legendary figure in California history. So a lot of other stuff got written, and it was all kind of based on that original novel by John Roland Ridge. So he's an interesting figure. You could do a lot with him. Sarah Winnemucca. For those of you who live in Winnemucca, or if you at least are familiar with the town, you might know that it's named after Sarah Winnemucca, or maybe her father, but I think is actually considered to be named after her. She was an interesting figure in the late 19th century as well. She was an educator, she was an actress, and she was also a writer. So she wrote a pretty extensive history of the Northern Paiutes, her tribe, and it was again one of the first like major texts to be published by a Native American, and almost certainly the first major text to be published by a Native American woman in the 19th century. She also opened a school for Native American children in what is now, I believe, Lovelock, Nevada, and was also a part of a touring acting troupe. So she was very talented and also an important writer. So you can study figures like those from history, but there's also plenty of 20th century Native American writers that you could study as well. Darcy McNichol, Louisa Erdrich, Erdrich is still writing today. So, you can do a lot with that particular category as well. Asian American writers, again, you can go back to around the turn of the 20th century and start finding historical examples, but we have a lot of contemporary examples, writers like Maxine Hong, Amy Tan, who was very popular like in the late 20th century. So these are just different categories, ethnic or racial categories of writers, but also just ways to approach particular texts, because we might think that there are particular thematic concerns, historical contexts, or other things that link those texts and those writers together. So it's just another lens, another approach that we can take. And at this point in the chapter, they kind of shift gears and start talking a little bit more about sort of literary history and different phases of literary history, at least in the US. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this because, again, these are periods that are important for cultural studies. So they talk about modernism and then postmodernism. So these matter for us today because a lot of our present culture has probably been shaped by these particular periods that occurred, at least if we're thinking about texts and literary production. So they talk about modernism as kind of beginning like in the early 20th century, like roughly 100 years ago. It's kind of a rejection of older, like Victorian values, like from the 19th century, and those old ideas of like moral instruction. As I've said before, a lot of older literature was supposed to have a strong moral component. So it was supposed to teach a lesson. It was supposed to make you a better person. Modernism started to move away from that. And modernism also moved away from the strict realism that was dominant in the 1800s. Excuse me, I'm starting to run out of my voice is running out here. So it was just kind of a rejection of a lot of those older styles that we have probably experienced as students, right? They talk about how realism was dominant throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. But by the early 20th century, the world had changed a lot. The world had modernized in a lot of ways. We had cars and movies, and after World War I, there was kind of this sense of like disillusionment. We had a lot of people coming back from the war. As you guys probably know, if you've taken a history class, World War I was incredibly destructive, in Europe. And it really changed people's minds when it came to these like ideas about universal truth, and the sort of things that maybe we held more as being more valuable in earlier periods. So what modernism helped to introduce were more experimentations when it came to like point of view and space and time. It introduced this literary technique known as stream of consciousness. A lot of these writers were more interested in subjective impressions of reality instead of that one true version that the older realism style was trying to capture. So modernism is often thought of as really embracing fragmentation, ambiguity, right, and subjective experiences. And that's partly because of World War I. It's partly because of the rapidly modernizing world, and it's just a development in literature. It's just a sort of part of the growth and evolution of dominant literary forms. So if you think of authors like Virginia Woolf, William Faulkner, Ernest Hemingway, James Joyce, these are all considered modernists. They're all using stream of consciousness. Their characters and themes are more ambiguous. They're more interested in subjective impressions. So this has a lot of impact on their style, on the way their books are written. And it's just more modern, as the term implies. So modernism really dominates the early 20th century. And then by the middle of the 20th century, we move more into what is known as postmodernism, which is often thought of as kind of a rejection of all of these classical notions of truth, reason, identity, and objectivity, basically rejecting the idea of great, natural progress or universal progress or some grand narrative or grand universal truth that we can all subscribe to and understand. So postmodernism borrows a lot from post-structuralism. If you remember that critical approach from several weeks ago, again, challenging this idea that there's ever one stable truth that you can pull out of a text. It's like, no, there's multiple truths. Language is not stable. right? So there's never one meaning. It's never constant. It's never universal. So that can be frustrating. It can be a little bit alienating for some, but it's also largely looked at as a symptom of the modern world. By the time postmodernism comes around, we just get out of World War II, right? So we have another major war. Now we have the threat of nuclear annihilation. We have even more modern advancements. The world is changing rapidly. So we're getting rid of a lot of these old notions that would have shown up in older literature, and we're adapting to a rapidly changing world. Also, postmodernism is often thought of as kind of playful and self-referential. So if you've ever heard the term like metafiction, that's often thought of as a part of postmodernism. That means a work of literature that's very aware that it's literature. And in some ways, the story it's telling is kind of based on the fact that it knows it's a book, a movie that knows it's a movie. It references its own fictionality, right? Whereas the older forms of realism would have never done that, right? With an old fashioned realistic novel, the author would have tried to capture reality and never really show that, hey, this is all just a work of fiction. By postmodernism, we don't care as much about that, fateful rendition of everyday life. Now it's more about capturing subjective impressions. It's more about capturing how weird things are, how things are changing. And it's also having fun with these literary categories, with these literary traditions that we are using. So you're kind of referencing your influences. You're referencing the stuff that you're borrowing from. You're referencing the genre that you belong to. A science fiction movie that's sort of paying homage to earlier science fiction movies, but also kind of making fun of certain aspects of science fiction while still using the genre to create something new, right? That's often thought of as a very postmodernist kind of thing, right? So writers like John Barth, Thomas Pynchon, David Foster Wallace, they're all considered postmodernists. And a lot of people think that we're still kind of in a postmodern moment. A lot of people think that our present culture today still owes a lot to postmodernism. And postmodernism kind of takes hold in like the 60s, the 70s, really like the late 20th century. But a lot of it still exists today. Um, that's probably enough on all of that history stuff. But before we move on to new historicism, just take a quick look at the examples of using cultural studies on our familiar texts. So in the book, on page 329, you can see the cultural studies approach being used for To His Coy Mistress. And then on page 331, you can see how it's used on Frankenstein. I think you guys will enjoy the example of Frankenstein because they're really talking about all of the movie adaptations of Frankenstein, but not just movies, right? All the other ways that that particular narrative shows up in popular culture, right? So it starts as a very highbrow novel from a long time ago, but now, as we've already seen, Frankenstein exists in comic books, TV shows, movies, cartoons, Halloween decorations, right? So you can do all kinds of interesting pop culture analysis looking at these more modern adaptations of Frankenstein. So when they talk about pop culture analysis in the chapter, they say there's a couple of different kind of, areas that you can look at. Production analysis, the actual textual analysis, and then historical analysis. So again, production analysis kind of goes back to some of those questions we were asking before. Who created the text? Who published the text? who owns the media, right? Who's consuming the text, right? Thinking more about how it gets made and how it gets read or seen. And then, of course, you can always do the classic textual analysis where we're really just studying the work of literature itself. And then we can do more historical analysis. So that brings me to my final point for today, which is the new historicism. All right. So we're going to consider this to be our final critical approach. We don't get a chapter on it in the book, but we've already talked about the traditional historical approach to literature that's existed for a long time, right? So, like we've said, we've always used history as a way to understand certain literary texts, right? So, we've always used historical context as one of our tools to understand a particular novel or poem or play. So that's always been a dominant method, but for a while we moved away from it. So remember the formalists, right? They rejected historical context. They didn't care about those factors that might have helped to shape the text. They just wanted to focus on the text, on the literary elements, the features of language. That's all they wanted to do. They didn't care about the author. They didn't really care about the readers, and they didn't care about historical context. But by the 1980s, you had more and more critics who were saying, actually, historical context does matter. So figures like Frederick Jameson, Stephen Greenblatt, Michel Foucault, who was a French guy, they really helped to kind of recenter the importance of history and historical context to the study of literature. But because it was a little bit different than the old historical approach, we started calling it the new historical approach, or new historicism for short. So we are interested, once again, in the social, political, and historical factors that help to produce a work of literature. But if you remember, the old historical approach was ultimately more about history than it was about literature. Remember, that's how all the traditional approaches were. They all viewed literature as a vehicle for better understanding philosophy or history or the biography of the author. And literature was very much secondary. But for the new historicist, they said we don't have to rank the importance of these things, right? It all works together, right? So the history and the literature, they're not really that separate. They often function in very similar ways. And I think we can observe this, right? The way we learn history, the way we understand history is largely through narratives. We need characters. We need plots. We need themes. All of the stuff that we're going to find in a novel or a short story. So a lot of the new historicists said that really you can study or read literature like history, and then at the same time, you can read and study history much like it is literature. We don't have to have such sharp lines dividing these different academic categories. So, again, the new historicists are bringing history back, but in a slightly different way. They're not just using the literature to better understand different historical periods. Instead, they want to read history like literature. They want to read literature like history. And they want to analyze, that historical context, what might have shaped the particular text in question, right? So if we're going to read Frankenstein, let's understand what was going on in the early 1800s. What was going on with science? What was going on politically? What was going on socially? Let's understand a little bit about the English Romantic poets, because Mary Shelley was married to one of them, right? So let's understand that historical moment in order to better understand the novel. But what they also want to do is think about the historical moment in which a text is read. So, yeah, we can study the historical context that surrounds Frankenstein, right, back in the early 1800s. But if we are reading Frankenstein today in the year 2025, then we might also want to think about our present moment, our present historical context. What's going on right now? And how will it influence our reading experience? How will our present moment impact our understanding of the novel? So it's not just about going back to the older historical context. It's also understanding our present historical context if we are reading an old novel or, an older work of literature. But of course, if we're reading something contemporary, we are very much thinking about our present contemporary historical context. So new historicists are looking to situate, you know, works of literature within their particular historical context, but they're also using literature as a way to understand history, right? We can take a work of literature and treat it almost like an artifact. It tells us a lot about that time. So again, it goes both ways. We're not just using historical context to understand lit. We're not just using lit as a way to understand history. We're doing both, right? We're doing both. They're not mutually exclusive. So again, it just opens up new opportunities. And we have this instinct, this natural impulse, I think, to use history when we're reading texts, right? We want to look at historical context oftentimes because that gives us more to talk about. It gives us more content. So we can do that if we want to use the new historicist approach. So a classic quote from them is to always historicize. So that means no work of literature can really be read in a vacuum. You can't ignore the history of Frankenstein when you're reading it. But that means the history of Frankenstein's time and the history of your time when you're reading it, right? None of this stuff operates in a vacuum. None of this stuff is separate from the society that created it or the historical factors that helped create it. So it's very different from what the new critics were doing. It's very different from formalism, right? We can embrace the historical context as long as we're doing it in this more modern, sort of holistic way. All right. So just like reader response brought the reader back and said, hey, we can talk about the readers, new historicism brings history back. And it's another thing that we can consider, study. It's another lens that we can use to analyze literature. All right, so that's enough for today. It's getting very dark in my living room, so I'm going to sign off. Next week, we're going to talk about our next critical response paper. So you have all of the critical approaches at your disposal. Next week, you're going to pick one, and then we're going to start working on that next critical response. So that's what next week's lecture will be about. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you next week.